Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance. In this presentation, we're going to be continuing our video series on testing physical performance, and this one is going to be on testing power. So what is power? So power in mathematical terms is force divided by time, which basically means that we're trying to produce maximal force in minimum time. So the more force we can produce in the least amount of time is going to give us the greatest power output. However, power in reality is time dependent. Essentially, in athletic movements, power refers to how much force we can produce in a set time rather than in minimum time, because different movements are going to have different amounts of time they take to complete. So for example, if we have something like a shot put, where the shot put athlete has a given amount of time, maybe a second, to throw the ball as far as possible. So they spin around the ring, and then that last sort of spin might take somewhere around 1 second to complete. So they have about a second to produce as much force as possible in order to launch the ball as far as possible. Whereas something like a sprinter, when they're sprinting at maximum speed, they only have a fraction of a second each time their foot hits the ground to produce force. So it's not that they are trying to minimize the time, it's that the exercise is going to determine the amount of time, and they just need to produce as much force as possible within that time frame. So I've got these arrows here to demonstrate this power equation again. So we want to maximize force, so the more force and the least amount of time we can produce that force in, the greater the power is going to be. So if we have less force or greater time to produce that force, our power is going to decrease. So what tests are we going to employ in order to test power for our athletes? So we have a few different categories of power based on that time constraints of the exercises we were talking about. So we can have slower power, which is going to be basically greater times to produce force. So things like loaded jumps, and we can use height as a measure, or even power if we have a force plate. Or we could use things like heavy implement throws, and we can use distance as a measure. And these tests are going to test basically how much force we can produce in sort of a higher amount of time. So we're going to have more time to produce force, which means that the athletes that can produce maximal forces better are going to be better at these tests. We then have fast power. This is going to be essentially the same thing, but basically decreasing the amount of time they have to produce force. So something like a vertical jump that's unloaded, and we can use height like a Vertec, or we can use power if we have a force plate. We can use broad jumps for distance unweighted, or we can use, again, implement throws of lighter weights, and we can use distance as a measure for that. And the last category is reactive power, and for these sort of tests, we're trying to test the ability to use the stretch shortening cycle. So essentially, we're really minimizing ground contact times or time to produce force to extremely small amounts, and that's going to basically allow us to test how efficient we are at using the elastic properties of the tendons. So something like a drop jump is probably going to be the best way to do this. So we can drop off a box of different heights, and we can then use reactive strength index or power, and you basically need a force platform to measure this type of power. The other thing we can do is create a power profile, which is essentially taking all of these into consideration and seeing where their strengths and weaknesses are. So if we have a look here, we have a series of tests which basically are very similar, but they're different in the amount of time the athlete has to produce force. So for example, we got a jump squat here at 80% of body weight that we can load onto a bar, jump squat here at 50% of body weight that we can load onto a bar, an unloaded vertical jump, and then a drop jump, and we're going to measure reactive strength index there. Because the load's greater, we're going to have more time to produce force, and then as the load gets lower, we have less time to produce force. So if we have a look at the team average here in blue, we can then have a look at athlete A, who maybe they're very good here at the jump squats at heavier loads, so they're well above average here, but then when they get to their unloaded vertical jump, they're sort of just around average, and then with their drop jump, they are less than average. So this athlete A, we can see from this power profile that he's probably quite force dominant, so he's good at the higher loaded jumps, but then the unloaded and reactive jumps he's worse at. So he probably needs to do more of the power type training at shorter ground contact times. Athlete B is basically, if we have a look here, is basically the opposite. So he's well above average in the drop jump measures, and he's above average in the unloaded vertical jump measures, but he's only sort of average with the 50% body weight jump, and then with the 80% loaded body weight jump, he's actually below average. So he probably needs to do more force dominant training, so more strength and heavy power training. So when we're performing the actual power tests, there's a few things we need to take into consideration. So the first thing and most important thing, whatever test we are doing, we need to make sure we have a consistent protocol. And that's necessary for all tests in order to ensure that when we see changes, they're actually due to the training and that it's not just an error in our testing protocols. And the second point is to make sure that we just use the best tests for our team or our athlete based on a number of factors. So our budget, so if we don't have enough money for expensive equipment, like force plates, we're not going to be able to use them to test our athletes. How much time do we have to test? Do we want to do tests that are going to take a longer time to record and analyze? Or do we want to do quick, simple tests that we can just write down one number? What facilities are we working in? Are we working just in an open park with no facilities and we have to bring whatever equipment we want? Or are we actually in like a gym setting with state-of-the-art equipment that we can do heaps of testing on? What equipment do we have available, which is similar to the facilities? If we don't have the expensive equipment, we can't do some of the tests. And then also another big one that often gets overlooked is the athlete's preference. So what are they going to be engaged doing? And do they actually understand what they're doing? If you want to do a fancy power profile with them, but they have no idea what that means, they're probably not going to be that engaged, and they're probably not going to put that much effort into it, and they're probably not going to care much about what it says. Whereas maybe a simple test just like a medicine ball throw or a vertical jump, they'll be much more engaged in and actually understand what the results mean. Especially for young athletes, this is really important. They're probably not going to care much for reactive strength index or force production. They just want to see how far they can jump, how high they can jump, or how far they can throw something. If you're a curious individual who's interested in learning more about sports performance training, you can find Flow High Performance on Facebook and on Instagram. On these platforms, you'll find hundreds of these research infographics, which are the latest research summarized into these easy to understand pictures so that you can stay up to date with the latest research without actually having to go into the journal yourself and reading the entire article.